Hey, welcome back to the eDrum Workshop. I'm Luke and I hope you're having a great day. If you're in the market for a beginner electronic drum kit or just a compact practice kit that will fit somewhere snugly in your house, apartment or the corner of whatever room you've got going free, there are quite a lot of options available these days in the sub $1,000, €1,000, £900 price bracket. So when Roland recently revealed their newest budget kit, the TD-07KV kit, there were a lot of people asking, well, if it's any good, whether it's the right choice for them in their situation, and whether or not it's worth the price considering the other options that are available. I'm aiming to answer those questions for you in this in-depth review of the Roland TD07 kit, so let's get to it. I put out a first impressions video for this kit a few weeks back, but I finally had enough time to properly weigh up my thoughts on it. If you do want to see what I had to say about the kit when I first got hold of it, I'll leave a link to that video below. There will be some overlap in this review, but I'm going to try and steer clear of too many of the exact same talking points. And as I did in that previous video, I'm going to try and keep this kit's target market in perspective because it's not aimed at a user like me. And it's really going to come down to who you are and what you need out of a kit like this as to whether it's the right choice for you or not. So this kit comes with a full mesh head setup. This is very welcome at this price point considering that the kit it replaces had rubber toms. The snare on this kit is a dual zone PDX-8 8-inch pad and the toms are the PDX-6A pads which are 6.5-inch single zone pads. It also comes with a separate kick drum tower, the KD10, a simple hi-hat controller, a CY5 pad for the hi-hat cymbal and two CY8 cymbal pads for the crash and ride cymbals. The kit's all held together on this MDS compact rack which has a nice small footprint and the cymbal arms are included too. One of the best parts of this kit in my opinion is that KD10 kick tower. As far as compact kick drums go, this is the best feeling one that I've played. You can use this with a double kick drum pedal and it triggers very well when you're using it as long as you set your beaters up correctly, which is something that a lot of other small pads struggle with. It can wobble around a little bit from side to side if you get really energetic with it, especially if you're using a double kick pedal. But I personally haven't had too much issue with it creeping forwards or backwards. There's Velcro on the bottom of it and the spurs really help if you've got a carpet for it to dig into. Now the rest of the components that come with this kit are solid but they are a little bit of a mixed bag. The hi-hat pedal is functional but it doesn't look like the most durable piece of kit and I think it would have been much nicer for the FD9 pedal to have been included with this kit because it did used to feature at this price range. However, you are still going to get good performance out of the included FD1 pedal. The PDX-8 snare pad that comes with it is very playable for its size. The plastic rings are a little bit annoying but I get on with them okay, and the PDX-6A tom pads are fine. I don't really have a great deal else to say about them to be honest. It would have been nice if they were bigger, it would have been nice if they were dual zone, but they'll do the job just fine. The cymbal pads work great. Roland cymbals are some of the best on the market and although they're small, once again they're up to the task. The biggest downside for me is having a CY8 as the ride cymbal. This is a small cymbal and there's no bell zone. Pretty much every other option at this price point has a 3-zone ride cymbal, so it's a real shame not to see one here. You can swap the zones around to put the bell on either the bow or the edge if you want to. That does work okay, but I would probably recommend for a lot of people to upgrade to something like a CY13R to get that bell zone. Another decent option is looking around for a second-hand CY12RC cymbal pad. It is an old model that's a little bit chunkier, but they do go pretty cheap these days second hand and it'll definitely get the job done. The module does support 3 zones by using the Crash 2 input as a ride bell. That is a really handy feature that I'd like to see popping up on more modules, but it's a shame that you have to compromise between either adding a pad or having a bell zone. The cymbal mounts that come with the kit are good. They've got fully adjustable ball joints on them, so between that and the rack clamp adjustments you can get them at pretty much whatever angle you need from them. Unfortunately, you only get one long cymbal arm and the other two are short ones. I decided to set mine up the way that Roland suggests, which is having your left crash up higher and the other two using the short poles, but this is pretty much how I set up my cymbals anyway, so you might need to tweak it for your preference. And then finally, in terms of hardware, you've got the rack. This is going going to be pretty perfect for some people and a bit inflexible for others. Compact racks like this are great for saving space, and there are a few things that you can swap around if you need to. If you need to fit this kit into a corner or quickly fold it down to throw it in a closet or a cupboard, it's pretty much perfect for that. And if this kit is for a younger player or you're under about 6 foot in height, you probably won't have too much to complain about. I'm about 6 foot, 6'1", and I struggled a little bit to get these pads exactly where I wanted them to be. I personally sit quite high on my throne with my legs angled downwards because that's the most comfortable position for my back, and this rack with its stock configuration had everything just a little bit too low, especially the snare drum. So the first tweak that I made to the stock setup was spinning the clamp around so that the snare drum mounts from the top of the bar. This gives you a little bit more height to play with and made it much more comfortable for me. You could also swap around these two bars. It would mean having to lower the left hand rack bar a little bit, so that may or may not work for you, but it would give you the opportunity to get your snare up even higher. Or the other option is just to mount the snare pad on its own dedicated stand. Now there's not a whole lot of scope for customizing the pad setup that much. The rack does reverse to a left-handed setup very easily, which is great, but really the cable snake is going to be the biggest factor that will limit how far you can move everything around. The cable for the second tom goes far enough to mount down on the right hand rack bar if you wanted to play 1 up 2 down, but if you do want to move anything even further out, you might need to use some kind of extender. If you've already got other TRS cables available, you could just use a jack coupler like this. That would let you chain a cable off the end of an existing one, or you could get a TRS jack extension cable like this one. Both of those solutions should get you to where you want to be. You're also limited to the height of your toms by the height of these vertical bars. There's not really much of an upgrade path for this kit either. You do get that one extra input that I mentioned before, the Crash 2 input. You can of course assign any sound to that input, but that's your lot. The module only accepts single zone toms too, so you can't upgrade these pads to dual zone toms and expect an extra zone. And to be honest, there's not a lot of room on this rack to add many other pads anyway. If by the end of this video you do decide that you like this kit but you do want to see some customization options for your rack, I very recently put out a video about rack expansions and customizations, and I included this rack on that video. I'll leave a link below to that video, go check it out after this one. So the general theme of this kit is that Roland have picked every component to specifically fill a particular purpose, but they do perform those functions very well. Next up, I'm going to talk about the TD07 module because for me at least, this is the most interesting part of the kit. I covered how this module compares to the TD17 module quite heavily in my previous video, but the general gist is that it's a bit of a strange middle ground between a downgrade and an upgrade in some areas compared to the 17, though it does overall skew more towards a downgrade as you would expect. You don't get to import samples or layer sounds on this module like you do on the TD17, but they did include some sound design feature upgrades that aren't present in the TD17 module. So just on the face of it, overall, one of my biggest gripes about this module is the fact that they've removed the left and right master outputs from the back of the module. It's pretty much always been a standard part of Roland modules at this price point, and taking it away just kind of seems a little bit pointless. Now, if you are a beginner and you're only going to be using this for quiet private practice, this might not affect your usage at all. And that's completely fine, you'll get what you need out of it, and that's great. And on modules like the TD17 and the TD11, the master outputs and the headphone outputs have been practically joined at the hip anyway for a long time. They're both controlled by only one volume knob, and there's no way of routing anything to only the headphones or only the master. However, taking away the left and right outputs entirely kind of seems like limitation just for the sake of it. It means that if you do want to hook this up to a PA or some other kind of speaker system, you'll probably need a cable like this that splits an 1/8 inch or 3.5mm jack cable into a stereo pair of 1/4 inch or 6.35mm mono jacks. If you were thinking about using a kit like this in a gigging situation, you're probably better off plumping for the next tier up, the Roland TD07KV, or looking around on the used market for something that fits the bill. As far as the rest of the connections go, it's great that they didn't remove the 1/8" mix-in jack. Bluetooth compatibility is a great feature that I hope that they're going to keep using on every single module, but I would never want that to completely replace the physical ports. Unfortunately though, they don't have any DIN MIDI sockets on this module. Most of the lower tier modules haven't had MIDI in for a long time anyway, but this one doesn't have MIDI out either. The MIDI functionality for this module is limited entirely to the USB port, and that USB port is something that I'm going to dig into a little bit deeper later on. Moving along to the other features of the module, this is where Roland do a very good job for people who are either new to e-drums or just drums in general. The module's simple to use and it's easy to navigate the menus, with most options or features being in pretty logical places. It's also a huge step up compared to something like the TD1 module, which comes on the Roland kits below this one. So if you were choosing between the two, the module on the TD07 could sell it for you. I would have liked to have seen a bigger screen on this module. This tiny screen is really pushing it in my opinion. Fortunately, there's not so many options that it becomes a deal breaker. Each of the face buttons is pretty clear on what it's for. You've got a big drum kit button that takes you to the kit selection. You've got simple left and right and enter and exit buttons for navigation, along with a dial in the middle for scrolling through parameters. When you're on the drum kit screen, you can also use the left and right buttons or the dial to scroll between kits too. Over on the bottom right of the module are the volume buttons. This is a very standard control to have. You wouldn't really think there'd be much to say on the matter, but one thing that I did notice is that it changes the volume of the kit itself and the metronome along with it, but it doesn't increase the volume of anything going into the mix-in port or through the Bluetooth connection. On the one hand, it's useful to be able to have independent control of your drum volume, but there isn't any other gain feature for the mix-in port or the Bluetooth connection, so if you're struggling to get the volume that you want out of whatever device you've got connected, it means you're kind of stuck. Above this on the module, you've got some really useful features to aid your practice and timekeeping. The metronome, which is the middle button, is a simple affair. You press the button and it turns on, you press it again and it turns off. Then you can go right from here to set your tempo, the volume of the metronome, the number of beats in the bar, the rhythm of those beats or the subdivision, the panning of the metronome, the sound that's used for the click, there's a lot, and whether the button's LED flashes along with the click or not. If you need to practice your rudiments or just the general steadiness of your timekeeping, this will help you do that. The button to the left of this is even more useful, the coach mode. This gives you a few different features that can really help you work on your timing. The time check gives you a visual indicator of how in time you are with the click, and then it scores you at the end. Quiet count is a super useful one in my opinion. This gives you a few bars of a click to play along to, and then it goes silent for a few bars, leaving you to fend for yourself, and then it comes back in, once again scoring your progress. This is a very handy feature for those who are starting out, and it's pretty fun to play around with. Auto up and down gradually increases the tempo as you go, and change up changes the rhythm of the beats as you go along, which is great for practicing your subdivisions at a particular tempo. For each of these modes, if you go across to the right, you can change the duration of the exercise, the tempo, and a few other variables. This is a really good practice tool that I'm glad that Roland are including in pretty much every beginner and intermediate kit nowadays. The last button along on this row is the kit edit button, and this is where you could spend a lot of time if you really wanted to. Some people will only want to pick a stock kit and start playing, and that's completely fine. The selection of preset kits on this module is actually pretty good, but a big draw of this module at this price point is the instrument selection and its ability to heavily edit that selection. There's 143 sounds built in, which isn't the largest number available for this price point, but it does have a lot of flexibility inside of those sounds. Sound is a really subjective thing, and we're probably going to argue until the end of time about whether or not Roland has good sounds. But personally, I think that the sounds in the module are very good for the purposes, and the ability to customize those is simple yet surprisingly deep. Once you pick your instrument, you've got volume and pan controls, and then you've got the V-edit functions like tuning or cymbal size, which increases or decreases the pitch of the sound, muffling, which lets you dampen the sound, sound, head type, which emulates different styles of drum head, beta type for the kick drums, which changes the impact type of the kick drum, and then the ability to turn the head and rim link off so that you can edit the two zones independently. Then if you want to get even deeper into editing the sounds, they've brought over some of the features from the higher end modules. Some of these features aren't even inside the TD17 module, like the transient and the overhead controls. For anybody who's not familiar with features like this, or features like EQ or ambience settings, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of what each feature does and how it generally affects the sound. So the transient changes what's known as the attack or release of a sound. If you turn down the attack, you'll get a softer initial hit, whereas if you increase it, it will make the sound more impactful. Decreasing the release of the transient will make the sound decay quicker, but it's a little bit more fine-tunable than the muffling options. And increasing the release makes it sustain for longer. Pad EQ lets you change the equalization of each individual pad. In its simplest form, EQ is basically changing how loud or quiet different frequency bands are. Roland gives you the ability to change 3 of these with controls over the finer details. I won't go too heavily into it, but basically you get the option to cut or boost the low end. These are the bass frequencies, the mid frequencies, which for many drums are generally where the tone of the instrument sits, and the high end frequencies. This can be anything from a nice top end shimmer to nasty hissy frequencies, and you can make the boosts or cuts to these as subtle or extreme as you like. The overhead controls are basically a simulation of having an acoustic drum setup where you would use a pair of overhead microphones to capture the cymbal sound and some of the ambient sound of the drum kit. It can make a really big difference to the overall sound of the kit, and if you get these settings right, you can turn a lifeless kit into one that really pops. So you've got the on-off switch for the overheads, then there's the type option. This is basically like a preset for the whole setting. You can choose between a bunch of different styles of overhead setups, and this will change the other parameters for you. So for a lot of people, you'll possibly never need to go past this particular screen, but if you do, you'll find that you can then change the mic type, which is sort of emulating different styles of microphones which will enhance or dull certain frequency bands, kind of like an EQ setting for the overhead microphones. Then you can change the width of the mics. As you go up, you're basically making it sound more stereo, and then there's the level of the overall overheads, followed by the send, which controls how much of each drum ends up in the overall overhead sound. The closer to 0 dB that you get, or if you choose to go past it, the more goes into the overheads. The room control is basically the ambience setting for the kits. It simulates different sizes and shapes of room, with controls to change how far away things sound, the length of the ambience tail, then you've got the same send options as the overheads, and the head and rim split options too. Then finally you've got the MFX or multi-effects. There's a bunch of these with some pretty fine-tunable settings, everything from delay effects to distortions, phasers, flanges and bigger reverbs, and they range from functional and subtle to outright craziness. And again, you get a send setting for each zone. Beyond these settings, you've got options to change the name of your kit, change the MIDI notes for each zone, copy kits. This is handy if you want to duplicate a kit and make changes without affecting the original, as well as a kit reset option, which is another great function to see. If you manage to mess up a kit entirely, then you can just use that to put it back to its default state. So these are all great features to have on a module at this level. You don't necessarily have to dive into any of these settings if you don't want to, but once you've got a good handle on the module, and if you feel like you've sort of exhausted exhausted the preset kits, these give you a simple entry point into tweaking drum sounds but with a surprising amount of depth for personalization. And most of the options that you learn how to tweak here will directly translate to any other Roland modules if you choose to upgrade in the future. So overall, I think that it was really smart of Roland to include this level of options here. I touched on it briefly before, but this module also has Bluetooth functionality so that you can hook up your phone or another device to play along to music. This is the first kit of this level that Roland have included this functionality on. The function wasn't in the TD17L module which came with the KL kit, and I'm really glad that it's in here because it's a pretty big selling point over much of the competition in this price range. Playing along to music quietly is one of the main advantages of electronic drums, so it really makes sense to have this option there. It's easy enough to pair your phone and get it going. There's also the option to use MIDI over Bluetooth too. Speaking of MIDI, the USB port lets you send MIDI over USB to a computer for use with things like digital audio workstations or VSTs. For those of you that don't really understand what a VST is, it's basically a virtual instrument that you can control with software or a MIDI instrument like electronic drums. What people like most about these is that they're typically made up of a ton of perfectly captured acoustic drum samples. They're usually sampled in extreme detail and they give you control over all of the microphones like an actual studio recording of an acoustic drum kit would. Long story short, if you do want to use software like this along with an electronic drum kit, the TD07 makes this as simple as it could possibly be with only one cable. You can leave your module in the generic USB driver mode, hook up to a PC running one of these VSTs, and it should recognise it as a MIDI instrument. Speaking of the driver modes, there's another driver mode that you can swap to, the vendor mode, that will let you record the TD07's internal sounds as a stereo track as well as sending the MIDI data. Roland have nailed this, allowing their modules to act as audio interfaces with a computer. This is a great feature that makes recording both audio and MIDI data really simple without the need for an external interface. The last few features on this module are under the cog button. The setup menu is where you can tweak your pad settings. There's presets for the bulk of Roland's existing and previous pads, which is great, and you get the usual controls over things like the sensitivity, the threshold, the cross-stick sensitivity, and the more advanced trigger settings. This is also where you'll find the option to change your Crash 2 input to either a Crash 2 pad or a ride bell zone. There's also the MIDI control options under this setup menu. This lets you fine-tune how your module sends and receives MIDI as a whole, rather than just the note number of the pads which were found under the kit edit options. If you want a more in-depth look at what each of the MIDI controls do and how they apply specifically to electronic drums, I did a pretty comprehensive video on that topic which I'll leave a link to in the description and a card on the screen. Then there's also some standard system options like the contrast of this tiny little screen, USB volume controls, the USB driver mode, an earplugs option which limits the volume of the module. This is great for protecting your or your children's ears if they like to fiddle with the volume settings, and an auto power down timer. The last two options under the setup menu are for checking your software version or performing a factory reset. So overall, the module's pretty great for a kit in this price range. It does fall short on a few things, but then it also excels at others. When you couple that with the fact that overall the kit is a bit of a mixture of semi-upgrades and semi-downgrades, it's a little bit difficult for somebody like me to call. I can, however, see that Roland have really been trying to make this kit more compelling to its target audience, and from a lot of the comments on my first impressions video, it seems like the kit is actually speaking to those people. There's also the fact that as I was in the middle of making this video, Yamaha have brought out a new line of kits, the DTX6 series, and one of those models, the DTX6KX, occupies the same price point as this kit. At the time of recording, I've not really had enough time to fully formulate my thoughts on that kit, but the actual kit itself isn't that appealing with its rubber pads. However, the module on that kit does look very good for this price point. It's probably going to be the only other really serious contender at this kit's price point, so stay tuned for a video about that kit if you want to see my initial thoughts. So with all of these things in mind, I'm going to give you a quick run through of things that I would have liked to have seen from this kit, a general summary of the pros and cons, and then who I think this kit is suitable for and whether or not it's a good option at this price point. So personally, to hit the sweet spot with this kit, I would have preferred to have seen dual zone toms. I would have liked to have seen the better FD9 hi-hat pedal and a triple zone ride. The 3-zone ride is a particular sticking point for me because other kits at this price point have have one. The FD9 used to be included at this price range, and even if the kit didn't ship with dual zone toms as a standard, it would have been nice if the module supported them as an upgrade. Larger pads all round would have been another one for me, 8-inch toms ideally. Generally speaking, the market is moving away from smaller pad setups. People want bigger playing surfaces. I feel like pads of this size should really be kept to either the TD1 or just as add-on pads. And of course, I would have liked to have seen a 10-inch snare drum, but I'm not particularly surprised by the fact that we haven't got one. So blasting through the pros and cons, overall, the general pros of this kit are: the compact form factor is great for younger players or those who need to save space. There's a really good depth of options in the module for people who like to edit sounds. It's got some great coaching tools for all skill ranges. It's got mesh heads all round and the hardware is good quality. It has great VST performance and the Bluetooth functionality is really handy. The cons for this kit in my opinion are that it's got a very limited in and out functionality, the combined audio output in particular being a shame. There's little scope for expansion of the pad setup. That compact form factor might be a bit of a squeeze for some people. The single zone toms, the lack of a 3-zone ride for $1,000 is a real shame, and it's still not a particularly cheap option. Somewhere around £700, $800 or €800 would have been a brilliant price point in my opinion. There would have been an extra pro on this list, which would have been the module being the best one at this price range. Unfortunately, the new Yamaha releases put that into a bit more of a speculative sort of position. Because I haven't had any chance to try one of those modules out, I can't say for sure. Going off the examples that I've heard on the promo videos, the specs contained in the module manual, and just the general history of Yamaha modules being solid, I definitely think that's another option in this price range that's worth looking into. However, the main distinguishing thing that this kit still has over the Yamaha modules is the mesh pads all round. Some people really won't mind which playing surface they're using, but if you definitely want mesh, then this is still the best option at this price. So anybody who's getting into electronic drums or just drums in general for the first time that needs a nice simple but effective compact mesh kit to practice on is going to find a very enticing overall kit package with the TD-07KV. Or even if you've played acoustic drums for a long time but you need a compact setup that can take a bit of a beating, this is still one of the best options in this price range because there's a lot to be said for durability when it comes to hitting things with sticks. I would have loved to have seen Roland really turn up the heat and offer this at a slightly lower price point or include a few more bells and whistles, but I think that for the target audience of the kit it's still worth the asking price. I really hope you enjoyed this review. If you found it useful, please pop a like on the video and share it with anybody else that you think might find it useful too. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep up to date with electronic drum news, reviews, tips and tricks, and of course enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!